Hey everybody, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and we're continuing in our series on Biblical Theology 1, giving kind of an overview of the Bible. We're still looking at the issue of Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. And for those of you who've watched the previous videos, you'll know that I've expanded much past just Genesis 11, but we're looking at the contention in this video between Zion and Babylon. That from Babel comes Babylon, and that there's this contention in the book of Revelation, but also elsewhere through the prophets, and that's where the book of Revelation gets this. I know that it's a vision that God gave, but understand this isn't the first time it comes up. Is the Antichrist ruling from Babylon, as we see in Revelation 17, or is the Antichrist ruling from Jerusalem, such as we see in Revelation chapter 11? So I want to try to explain the contention here, and I want to kind of give some sort of an answer here. Hopefully this all makes sense, because there's a lot of deep, rich subject here that doesn't always get comprehended in the first passing. It's something that has to be wrestled with multiple times until it starts to sink in. So in Revelation 17, we see a woman that is riding the scarlet beast, and we see that this woman is given the identity of Babylon. Now, we've previously identified the beast as being kind of that composite beast. It's the Antichrist kingdom. That in Daniel 7, each of these four beasts represent a kingdom, but they also represent a person. So you have the beast of Revelation being both the Antichrist himself, and yet past the Antichrist being the Antichrist kingdom. You kind of have both being played on there. But who is this woman? I believe this woman is Jerusalem. And in this video we're going to get into it as to why, but really what it comes down to is the rest of the book of Revelation. That all of the things that John is referencing with the language that he chooses to use to record the vision, he's oftentimes quoting the Old Testament prophets, and when you go back and you look at the prophecies he's referencing, or the Psalms that he's referencing, and you just read the context, it's quite clear. This is a prophecy against Jerusalem. And even other times, like in Revelation 11, this one being like the chief one, look, it talks about the temple being measured. The temple's in Jerusalem, not in Babylon. You know what I mean? There's a controversy over Jerusalem. God has placed his name upon her, and yet she's continually in disobedience, or if she's not in disobedience, she's in possession of the enemies of God, such as before she's part of the inheritance of Israel. David's the one who finally takes Jerusalem for Israel. And before that, it's just one of the enemies of God that has possession of her. How long was she ruled before that? Revelation 11, it opens with the measuring of the temple area. The temple's given over to the Gentiles who are trampling it. And you can think of like Daniel 7 in the previous video, maybe it's 2 videos back now, that this beast that had iron teeth trampled underfoot everything that it could find. There's this trampling underfoot that's talked about with this beast, and here it is that the Gentiles are trampling on the temple. Do you see how there's a connection here? The 2 witnesses are prophesying until the beast comes out of the abyss and slays them. Now, when we look at the rest of the chapter, where else could this be but in Jerusalem? There is no temple in Babylon. The temple's not in some other place. And the temple, it's being measured, and there are worshipers there. This cannot be some sort of spiritual metaphor. This can't be a spiritual temple, like it's just the church. And I mean, how do you interpret the rest of the passage then? That the 2 witnesses are in front of this temple prophesying. What do you mean? Like they're in front of the church prophesying to what? No, there's no way that you can interpret this as some sort of a spiritual temple, or the heavenly temple, or the church, or something. This has to be the earthly temple in Jerusalem. which, by the way, if we take this as being future, that suggests that there has to be a future third temple in Jerusalem that has yet to be built. It even says later in Revelation 11, about halfway through or so, that this is the great city where the Lord was crucified. Where was Jesus crucified? Was it in Babylon? Was it in Egypt? Was it in Sodom? Was it in Germany or some random place on the map? No. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. And I mean, these are just simple questions. But for those of you who've done any study on the end times, you'll know there are ridiculous answers to these questions that people give. Where's the temple in Revelation 11? Where's the Antichrist kingdom? People will come up with ludicrous ideas instead of taking the obvious here. Now, the reason behind that is clear. If you say this is Jerusalem, then you have a lot of explaining to do, and that's the point of this video actually. If this is Jerusalem, then how could Revelation 13 be describing anywhere other than Jerusalem? You see what I'm getting at? The beast that comes out of the sea and establishes the abomination of desolation, that dragon statue, and it sets up the number of the beast. That's in Jerusalem. The Antichrist, if we look at this in context, then the book of Revelation and what it's trying to explain here, if we just take that seriously, this much seriously, that this is Jerusalem, we can find a narrative here. The Antichrist marches on Jerusalem, takes the city, sets up the abomination of desolation at the temple, slays the two witnesses at the temple, and then even gathers all armies to Har Megiddo, which is Armageddon, just north of Jerusalem. And we can look at this if we come with the context of the book of Daniel. If we know Daniel 11 talks about this Antichrist figure coming southward towards the beautiful land and taking the city eventually and establishing the abomination of desolation. You can read that in Daniel 11:30 and onward. If we take it seriously, the beast comes out of the sea. Why? Because he has to cross the sea to come to Jerusalem. Do you see how this kind of lines up a little bit? It starts to make a little more sense. What other evidence might there be in saying that the woman is Jerusalem? There are two Jerusalems. There's Jerusalem and Jerusalem. There's, here in Matthew chapter 2, we read of the Magi coming to Herod asking, "Where shall this one who is king of the Jews be born?" And it says that Herod was troubled and all of Jerusalem with him. There's the Jerusalem that is supposed to be rejoicing that at the coming of her king, but instead is actually troubled by it. There's a Jerusalem that is righteous, that God has called and put his name upon. And then there's this other Jerusalem that continuously is in disobedience with God, that identifies more with Herod, who viciously slays the righteous. The only reason Jerusalem would be troubled at the coming of her king would be some sort of allegiance to a different king and a different kingdom. It's kind of like Zion. There's Zion and there's Zion. There's the earthly place called Zion where the earthly temple dwelt upon. Then there's this Zion that's talked about by the psalmists and by the New Testament authors. This New Jerusalem concept that is our mother, and she is free. Do you understand what I'm getting at here? There's duality. There's depth here. There's more to it than the story than just looking at Jerusalem as a geographical place. Somehow Jerusalem has now become the enemy of God and not the lover of God. And even Jesus testified of her, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill all of the prophets." He asked his disciples, would it be right for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem? It's a weird question when you consider Moses did not even enter the promised land. He died outside Jerusalem. Jeremiah died in Egypt. Elisha was born in the north, buried in the northern kingdom. He did not die in Jerusalem. In fact, there are a lot of prophets that were in the northern kingdom that it's never recorded that they even stepped foot in Jerusalem. Ezekiel, there's no reason to suggest that Ezekiel died in Jerusalem. There's no reason to suggest that Daniel died in Jerusalem. So what is Jesus pointing out? He's saying something profound here. Jerusalem has given herself to that same spirit that has slain the prophets. And that's why when you go to Revelation 17 and you see this woman on the scarlet beast, and she's got the golden cup in her hand, and she's drunk on the blood of the saints. You who've slain all of the prophets. Why? What is this talking about? There's a Jerusalem that is drunk with the blood of the righteous, who represents Jezebel more than the daughter of God. Do you understand? Do you see what I'm getting at here? She's the one who has ridden the beast and therefore more identifies with the beast than with God. There's this Jerusalem that, like, though it's technically, yes, the geographical place, this Jerusalem is nothing of what God explains Jerusalem to be. The beauty that he sees Jerusalem as being. That when he saw her, he looked tenderly upon her, and he nursed her wounds, and he brought her back to health, and he clothed her with royal garment. In Revelation 11, the city is identified as the great city, a title classically given to Babylon and Nineveh, and we covered that in the last video as well. Yet it is called figuratively or spiritually Sodom and Egypt. In the same verse, we see that it ends by saying this is where Jesus was crucified. Once again, where was Jesus crucified? Jerusalem. Somehow, Jerusalem is Babylon. What has happened that because of rebellion, the daily sacrifice is given to the Antichrist? What is it that's taken place with this Jerusalem? That it's because she's defying God that she now adapts this other kingdom and is allowing the kingdom of darkness to be established in the land that God chose to be the kingdom of light. What is going on here? And maybe this is, by the way, here's the hint of the answer. This is why Isaiah claims that they have made a covenant with death and hell. The covenant of Daniel 9, which is expressed again in Daniel 11, this covenant is with death and hell. This covenant is with this Antichrist figure. This covenant is not with God. It's not the eternal covenant. It's a different covenant. It's a covenant of deception. It's full of lies. And because the people of Israel, the dwellers of Jerusalem, are giving themselves over to this false covenant, breaking away from God, they receive judgment. And the Antichrist can come in and establish himself. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about, like, quote, the Antichrist, or if we're talking about Titus destroying Jerusalem in AD 70, or we're talking about Herod setting up his temple, or his palace in Jerusalem, ruling over Israel, Judah specifically, ruling over Judah. Herod, a half Moabite. More Moabite than he is actually Israelite. And you're telling me this guy who slays the righteous, he's the one who's ruling over Jerusalem? There's something horrible that's happened. We read Jeremiah 50 and 51. It doesn't take long before you find these statements inserted regarding Jerusalem. And about halfway through, you start to ask the question, is the prophet talking about Babylon, or is he talking about Israel now? You start to get lost in the dialogue. Who's he talking about? Who's he addressing again? There's an interplay here. Babylon and Zion. Who is it that will rule over Jerusalem? Which culture is it that Jerusalem is going to represent? Is Jerusalem going to represent Zion or Babylon? Is Jerusalem going to choose to be the people of God dwelling in righteousness, with the name of God upon her? Or is Jerusalem going to continually, willingly say, I am the place that Satan can call his home? Now, we know the end of the story, so we know ultimately it's God who establishes his kingdom from Jerusalem. And this is the point of my next little paragraph here. Only the Son of David is given rights to rule from Jerusalem. As long as we, Christians, continue to search for any other place that Jesus should rule, or we search for any other Jesus than the one who rules there, we will continue, even as the so-called church, to be that same Jerusalem that is actually Babylon. Now look, when you see the pattern here, you can see that the pattern goes beyond just the geographical location. There's a spiritual reality here. There's a spirit of Antichrist, that though there are those who claim to be of the apostles, they went out from the apostles and showed they were never truly of the apostles. Though there are people who claim to be Christian, they continually deny Jesus the rule from Jerusalem, and they continually deny that Jerusalem has any significance, and therefore they have a horrible time explaining why it is that Jesus is going to return to Jerusalem specifically. These people, though they claim to be in Christ, something is horribly awry here. They're showing themselves to be this Jerusalem that is actually Babylon. And I know that's a hard line in the sand, and people don't like it when you make hard lines. But do you understand what I'm getting at here? Replacement theology, I think, is beyond the question of whether you just misunderstand a few scriptures. You look at 1 Peter 5:13, here's another evidence that this is probably Jerusalem and not Babylon or some other place on the map. 1 Peter 5:13, the way that Peter closes out his epistle, his first epistle here, he greets, he sends greeting to those who he's writing to from all the people who are in Babylon. Well, Peter's not in Babylon, he's in Jerusalem. There weren't very many times that it records Peter leaving Jerusalem. There's like 2 times, maybe 3 times in the book of Acts. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, Peter's always there. If you will, Peter's house church, so to speak, was Jerusalem. Just like Paul, even though he went on missionary journeys, he always came back to Antioch. Peter's writing from Jerusalem and he's calling it Babylon. Why? Because the leaders of Jerusalem claimed, we have no king but Caesar. Pilate asks, is this man king of the Jews? They say, we have no king but Caesar. Okay, they want Caesar, they'll have Caesar. And their Caesar came with a flood to destroy their city in AD 70. And came again with annihilation so that 6 million went up in gas chambers and ovens. This is the cost that even we as believers are not willing to consider. This is the cost of being Jerusalem, of being Israel, of being the place and the people that God has put his name upon, and yet refusing to be that. There's a cost to it. And it's not that I'm saying that we need to just give it up and become more humble. It's not some rah-rah Jesus kind of thing that we're looking for here. It's much more like, will the real Jerusalem please stand up? And this is why Paul mentions not all Israel is Israel. Yeah, they're technically Jews. Yeah, they're technically Israelites. But they don't have the same character. The name Israel means something. It's a title given to Jacob, that because he wrestled with God and with man and prevailed, he overcame. He's now given the name Israel. To be Israel is to be an overcomer. And what exactly are you overcoming? You're overcoming the culture of Babylon. You're overcoming being that Jerusalem that claims to be God's people, that claims to be God's location, and yet you continuously reject God. You wrestle with God and with man until you come through on the other side. This is the cross and resurrection message. Do you understand what I'm getting at here? When God has made claim to someone, to a certain place, to a certain people, when God has made a claim to something, if that something continues to go its own way and refusing to bear the cross to come to resurrection, when that is the choice that is continuously made, there are consequences for that choice. Okay, so you prayed a prayer. You came into the kingdom. You now go to church every Sunday. But have you ever made that final devotion where you say, enough is enough, and you get down on your knees and you wrestle until you come through on the other side, and you can truly say you've got the new heart, the new covenant, and that you're a minister of this new covenant, a minister of reconciliation, now officially reconciled to God, and you're able to bring reconciliation to others? Do you see how this ties into everything? This is the gospel itself. In Ezekiel 28:13, we read through all of Ezekiel 28, or at least most of it, in the last video. In Ezekiel 28:13, there was a list of stones that are equated with Satan. You can compare that list to Exodus 28:17 through 20 and Revelation 21:19 and 20, and you can find similarities between these stones. Somehow the stones that are equated with Satan are also being equated with the priestly breastplate and the city of God in the new heaven and new earth. What's going on here? Is it possible that Satan was originally to be, quote, the covering angel, to use Ezekiel's wording, covering being the root word that atonement comes from? Is it possible that Satan was to be that covering angel over the Israel of God? But instead, he forsook that calling when he manipulated the darkness? Instead of embracing being that covering angel, being that guardian, that protector of Israel, that the one who brings the sons into maturity, that as Paul explains that the law was given as a steward would be one who was over the child until the child raises up to become an heir. Is it possible that Satan was to be like this with Israel, with humanity, with the people of God, raising them up unto maturity so that they might become heirs and inherit? But instead, he forsook that calling by manipulating the darkness so that they had to be put over new rulers, namely the law, so that the law might bring them to maturity. I don't know how much you understood what I was just asking there. You can rewind it and try it again if you need to. I think the result of Satan's ambition to rule over Zion, claiming Israel to be his own instead of raising them into maturity so that they might no longer be under him, but now would be the heirs and the sons of God, the result of this is the Antichrist kingdom. It is through Satan's influence that he causes the people Israel to bow to his mindset and wisdom, and it is through his influence that, quote, through rebellion, the abomination of desolation might be established. The one who was supposed to raise heirs for God, bringing them into maturity and fullness so that they might inherit the earth, so that they might be sons, mature sons and daughters who are heirs, co-heirs and rulers with Christ. He instead stunts their growth and oppresses them and pushes them down and says, "You'll never rule," and tries to usurp them so that he is the one who now rules. Do you see what I'm getting at here? And so God put them under something else, because death reigned from Adam to Moses. When the law was introduced, it was no longer this lawlessness. There was no longer this, they're suppressed and put under. Now, God has established a law so that there might be a new steward over them, so that through this one, they might come unto maturity and fullness, and to through Christ, reach that maturity and fullness to becoming sons and heirs and co-rulers. I know this is deep, and I know that you probably can't understand what I'm saying. That's why I'm recording it, so that you might have it later. There's so much that ties into this, and I don't even know how to express it. And I hope that you do understand it. I pray that you do. The people of God have been delivered from Egypt and yet have not fully found rest. You have in the book of Exodus, Israel comes out of Egypt. You have in the book of Joshua, they go into their inheritance, and yet they don't seem to find the inheritance. They don't seem to really find rest. That which they were expecting, that which was promised to them, it's not there. Because if they had found rest with Joshua, if they had truly come unto maturity to find the fullness, to find the inheritance, there would be no wavering back and forth between two opinions. You wouldn't have the prophets continuously asking them to come back to the Lord. If they truly found rest and fullness, you wouldn't have David in the Psalms. And the author of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 4 points this out. If they had rest with Joshua, the psalmist would have not had to say, "Today if you'll hear his voice, today if you'll hear his voice, then you might find rest." It was not until David took Jerusalem that it was finally possessed by Israel. I mean, do you see the significance of this? Jerusalem is the place that God says in the book of Deuteronomy, I'm going to put my name upon a specific place, and when I do, you bring your sacrifices to me there. And you've got all of the time of Joshua, all of the time of the judges, and all of the time of King Saul. They don't possess Jerusalem, and that's where they're supposed to be bringing the sacrifices to God. It's still in the enemy's hands. They were supposed to inherit it with Joshua, but because of their unbelief, they could not inherit Jerusalem, the very place that God put his name upon. And how long was it in the enemy's hands? How long did Satan adjoin himself to Jerusalem, claiming it to be his? And why would he even do it? Why does Satan want Jerusalem so badly? So that over and over and over again through the Old Testament, it's not like Satan comes in and tries to attack all of the cities except for Jerusalem. No, Jerusalem's the very first place he goes. Titus doesn't come in and destroy all of Israel and Judah. He comes into Jerusalem. And you can say, oh, it's because it was the capital. I think there's something more going on. Over and over again, Satan takes control of this land, of this city. And the question needs to be asked, why? Is he not content with Babylon? Why does he need Jerusalem? There's something here. There's an interplay between the stones. Where was that? There's an interplay here between the stones of the breastplate and the city of God and the stones equated with Satan in Ezekiel 28. There's an interchange here. There's something happening here. And I don't think that I fully understand it. I don't think that there are very many others, if anyone else, who does. Something's happening here that has been lost. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else consider this. One man came close. He's the one who stirred these thoughts, but never like this. Why does Satan attack the people of God, whether Jew or Christian? Why does he attack the people of God, period? Is it simply that we reflect something of God like so many of our pastors and teachers tell us? And he can't stand that we remind him of God, and so he hates us? Or is there something deeper? Again, what was he potentially supposed to be the one to bring us unto maturity? And so now, if we come unto maturity, it usurps his role. He's not able to rule. And he doesn't want us to come to maturity, so therefore he attacks us. He puts us into stupor. He gives us stupid, trivial things to consider over and over and over again. Why does Satan demand Jerusalem? Why not some other city? Heck, why not every other city? Why Jerusalem? Is it because God has put his name on it? Or is there something deeper here? Don't forget Revelation 18:4, by the way, where the call is made, come out from her, my people. Somehow this woman is Jerusalem under the Antichrist. The Antichrist is ruling from Jerusalem, and yet there are still the people of God who dwell there. And the angel is charging them, come out from her. What? How do you have the people of God dwelling comfortably, apparently, dwelling in the very place that is supposed to be the opposite of the culture that they're supposed to be in? Antichrist is not the opposite of Christ or like against Christ. Antichrist is everything that claims to be Christ and yet is not. And these people find that to be okay. They find that to be they're content here. I don't understand. This is the grand mystery of which I don't know how to more than scratch the surface of it. In fact, this is all I've got. What I've put forth already. This is all I've got. I hope that it at least stirs some thoughts for you and causes you to contemplate, but ultimately, I have no idea where else to go from here. So, I thank you if you've listened to this far. I thank you for listening to the whole thing. Until next time, grace and peace to you in Christ, which, by the way, next time we're going to be shifting away from nations in Genesis 11, and we'll finally be coming to Genesis 12. Genesis 12, of course, is the call of Abraham. So we're going to be looking at Abraham and asking the question of what are the people of God? What is Israel? We're going to be addressing these sorts of things, looking at God's rule of Israel. And I don't remember where we go from there, but that's what we have next. So until next time, again, grace and peace to you, and much love in Christ. Thank you for listening to the whole thing.